The purpose of tonight's meeting is to review recent design endeavor that the cities of Chelsea and Everett have begun to jointly undertake to begin engineering a flood protection solution for the area around the produce center, as well as the produce cluster and industrial properties along the Everett waterfront. We're currently, we sought and received funding from the State Office of Coastal Zone Management earlier this year to proceed with the first phase of design of some sort of elevated barrier in Chelsea, coupled with the concept design of flood protection infrastructure along Everett's waterfront. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to go over the general scope of the study and the design effort, and really to begin receiving feedback from businesses, property owners, and residents on the general design, what the community's desire for public access, and also it would allow us to better understand how some of these sites and businesses operate and what some of the concerns they may have in terms of operations, on-site infrastructure, and the like. So we can factor all that into the design plan. So our schedule right now has us completing a draft design package by midsummer, around July or August of this year. Subsequently, we will be seeking additional state funding to finish the design process and begin permitting. And at that point, it will allow us to begin discussing with federal partners larger infusions of funding that would be required to construct this infrastructure. There are a number of efforts that are going on in conjunction with this right now. So we work pretty closely with Chelsea Green Roots and the Mystic River Watershed on a lot of environmental restoration and civic engagement work in this space, as well as all of Chelsea Creek. We've also recently, with those partners, founded a Lower Mystic working group. The purpose of that working group is to have interdisciplinary folks from different communities along the Mystic strategize on how they can begin protecting their communities against the effects of climate change. As we're doing that, we're also working with federal partners to obtain a federal designation of this area that will be able to qualify us for larger amounts of federal money in the future. The focus there is really on some of the energy facilities and also the produce distribution facilities. Most of you, I think all of you, know a lot about this area, but just for for context, this produce cluster down here generates approximately $7 billion in economic impact every year. About 5,000 or so jobs are anchored by these companies, as well as additional companies in Everett. There's probably more along the lines of 15 or so thousand jobs when you factor Chelsea plus Everett together. These are companies that have been operating in both cities for generations, and they have roots in the community, and they also have a vested interest in maintaining their business and making sure it's sustainable. Right now we're working on the reconstruction of Beecham Street from Spruce Street to the Everett City line. Throughout that whole process, we've been able to engage very closely with the various property owners and companies here and learn a lot about their sites, their businesses, their operations, how we can factor all that information into the design, and also how we can ensure that we're not disrupting business when we eventually build all of this out. So this is another stakeholder meeting in a long line of meetings that we've held so far with business owners. We've primarily held most of them in the morning so far. This is the first evening one, and we would love to hear your feedback on where we are right now, what the science points to as being necessary for infrastructure, and also how we can factor all of that feedback into the design. We really envision this more as an open house and less of a formal presentation. So to start with, what we have up on the screen and at the table here are maps that show flood risk. And there are 3 different pieces of information on these maps. So the first, in the darkest blue, is what the current floodplain looks like. So that represents the FEMA floodplains. The lighter shade of blue, that's with the blue box underneath, is the projection of flooding out in the year 2030 during a 100-year storm. Technically, 100-year storms are only supposed to happen once a year. As you know, they're happening with increasing frequency. And then the lightest blue on the page, which has a much, much wider geography, is the projection of flooding in the year 2070. One of the reasons, and there are many, why this is so pronounced in this area is because of the environmental history of this being a tidal marsh that was filled up until really the 1960s. The soils poorly infiltrate water. They also are coastal influenced, so as the high tides come in, and if that coincides with rain, it really results in a pretty bad inundation period. So one of the limitations in all of this is that we have to figure out not just how to protect this area, but where are we really directing all the water to while we're designing these pieces of infrastructure. So with that said, feel free to mark up your properties on the map. If you have any questions, we have staff here to be in dialogue, answer them, walk you through what some of the science says in terms of flood risk, and then we can begin walking you through the design of a solution that will eventually protect this area. I think the easiest way to do this might be for anyone with businesses. Maybe we would begin by highlighting where their businesses are located and what type of use it is. No one has businesses here. All right, excellent. So that's easy then. So with that said, so the Island End River used to flow all the way up to where Chelsea High School is, and over the course of the last century, it's been filled in more and more, most recently when they filled in the area for the New England Produce Terminal. So naturally, that becomes the flood pathway. The black arrows you see over the water on the screen are the pathways that the water will be diverted to when this area floods. So one of our tasks right now is to evaluate what type of infrastructure can be designed and installed in those pathways to block that water from inundating this area. There's some complicating issues here. As we look out towards the end of the century, for example, these pathways aren't the only susceptible areas to flooding. We begin having to grapple with flooding coming from higher up the Mystic, over near the cities of Chelsea, Everett, and Boston. We also have to grapple with higher flood waters. So by 2070 or so, the projection right now states that the flood levels, flood water will be about 14 feet. If you're standing out in the Island and River area today on Beecham Street, let's say, that's probably about a 5 to 7 foot height of flood waters you'd be experiencing. So it's enough to significantly damage property, limit business activity, and impair transportation through the corridor. So last year we partnered with the city of Everett to begin pursuing funding to solve all of this. We've always been advancing and advocating for a solution that has multiple benefits. So it wouldn't just be a barrier, but it would be an area where we could have a boardwalk or some sort of public component to it. That's being advanced simultaneous to a lot of stormwater improvements in this area. And my colleague Greg, Director of DPW in Everett, if you want to say a couple words about what you're doing in terms of stormwater.
Yeah, so certainly the city is going after the latest CPR grant offered by CZM that just came out the other day. We're going to be trying to infiltrate some water in the upstream areas that contribute to the Market Culvert and the Island End flooding situation.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you not use acronyms?
I'm sorry.
That's okay, thank you.
Yes. I concur.
An acronym-free zone, please.
And I've been in that position before, and it is infuriating. So the Department of Coastal Zone Management, CZM.
Is that federal?
State.
State.
As part of the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, They offer a coastal pollution remediation grant, CPR, which looks to infiltrate as much as improve the water quality in these areas. Infiltration often promotes removal of phosphorus, which contributes to sort of the nutrient loading, that affects fish habitat and the quality of the water in the Mystic and the Malton rivers. The city has passed recent ordinances to regulate driveways and new impervious areas in town. We've also passed new stormwater ordinances that both mimic the municipal small stormwater system, MS4 permit, which is an Environmental Protection Agency, EPA permit. That came out a number of years ago. So we're looking at regulatory solutions as well as structural solutions. When we come down this corridor, certainly as Chelsea is reconstructing their portion of Regent Street, Everett's looking to reconstruct its portion as well. And that has a number of positive aspects, by replacing the drainage system, improving the sediment control in that area. We're also looking to see how can, whether it's berms and or whether it's walls, how do we make some of the businesses down in this area, as Alex mentioned, being filled tidelands. It just makes everything a little bit more difficult. And certainly being an industrial use that's been around for close to 100 years, there's still active rail spurs in this area. So how do you contend with that? It adds complication, it adds a number of parties outside of the normal and traditional permitting process. Now you're dealing with the MBTA, the Army Corps, the MWRA obviously has the commuter rail line through here, which last March had a foot of water over the commuter rail line. So now we're looking at public infrastructure and how does this, the 2030 model, the 2070 model, whatever model you pick has different impacts on electrical infrastructure as well as transportation infrastructure as well as commercial businesses. And certainly 2070 starts to have wider impact into the residential community as it flows across Route 16 and spreads through those flood pathways shown on the board. So there's no one solution, I think, is what we've come to realize over the last couple of months. And I think we're certainly striving to look at all funding avenues, all partnerships, all pathways to reach a layered approach to solving these flooding problems over time.
Yeah, so on the Chelsea end, we're working with our Public Works Department, the City of Everett right now on the Market Street culvert, which is a large diameter culvert that runs underneath Market Street, crosses underneath Beecham Street, and then deposits water into the Island End River. One of the big issues that we've noted and observed over the years is seawater flowing backwards through that pipe, and then ultimately when there are heavy rains, let's say, it ends up surcharging up through catch basins and flooding a lot of the area parking lots. So you have storm surges, waves bringing water over the embankment into some of these properties. That's really amplified by water coming out of the catch basins, and a lot of it, it's salt water. So echoing Greg's sentiment on the destructive impact really on property and infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure here wasn't designed to handle that kind of corrosion, to really have a lifespan that could survive this. So we're working on this culvert dilemma right now, and we're assessing a number of ways to reconstruct it, to repair it, and also to figure out, are there solutions at the property sort of boundary that we can begin working with private property owners on that could help reduce the flooding of their parking lots, for example. So that's underway concurrent to this, while we're also upsizing a lot of the drainage infrastructure on Beecham Street. So you'll probably, you know, I can't fathom how many times I've been through periods of flooding on Beecham Street. I assume you've witnessed it many, many, many times. And a lot of that is caused by undersized drainage on Beecham Street, but it's something we can, you know, relatively easily fix through this reconstruction program. But it's also caused by the fact that you have seawater coming up in the reverse direction through the culvert. So one of the features that Everett and Chelsea right now are pursuing is funding to install tie gates at the end of the culvert. So to begin shrinking the area that you see that is the projected floodplain.
When you speak of culverts, if you walked out the boardwalk that's on the edge
Yeah.
there, and you come out to the gazebo,
Yeah.
you look to the right, and there are two like tunnels.
Yeah.
Are those the
Those are the
culverts?
culverts.
Okay. And then the other question was, I thought back when that was designed, it was going to be all the ways to the post office. And then the bank that was there was bought out by People's.
Right.
And it never materialized.
Yep, yep.
How come the city hasn't gone back and see if they, I don't know whether it's an easement or what.
Right.
Because that would be a very pleasant walk for folks that like to walk.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a change in ownership of the bank. This, from my understanding, kind of killed the prospect of having a boardwalk over there. As part of this effort, we're proposing to install like an elevated barrier where the boardwalk is today. And that would lead all the way around up above the culverts behind sort of the bank parking lot to where the post office is. So we are designing this so we can include a boardwalk on top that leads all the way over to Market Street. So the question then becomes, and there are a lot of legal issues here, but can we extend that pedestrian access through Everett? Everett's coastline is a designated port area. You're really familiar with designated port areas in Chelsea, and it's tricky to add public space to them. But we can certainly bring it over to Market Street.
Question for the man from Everett. Over the past few years there, it looks like the companies, the freezer company and all those companies along there have sort of put in steel barriers to build up. But are they aware that you're doing this, and should they be built up higher if they're going to continue to prosper?
Sure. So one of the things, background into that conversation, is when Chelsea's flood maps were updated, Everett's one. So the county boundary falls between Everett and Chelsea, and when Federal Emergency Management Agency redid the maps of the coastline following Superstorm Sandy and Katrina and all the terrible hurricanes like that, Everett was left out of that model. And I would argue that, as we talked about earlier, Everett and Chelsea fall at the confluence of where the inland precipitation events meet that coastal storm surge. So we're a coastal community as much as we're affected by any other inland stormwater rainfall events on all the paved surfaces. So because Everett didn't fall under that past FEMA study, to say there was no elevation to design a wall to, none of the sheeting was likely designed to anything except maybe a foot above high tide or something, or mean high water, or some other designation such as that. So what we're coming to find out is, the FEMA's aware of that. FEMA's aware that the model affects Everett, affects Somerville, it affects Boston, affects other communities that were left out of that study. And they're going to apply those studies parameters to us in the upcoming years. So what that's going to do is, it's going to establish what that height would be for resiliency in the current day, the 100-year storm today. What this starts to look at is, okay, if we need elevation 10 today, and we're looking at a foot of sea level rise every 10 years. All of a sudden, you know, it's 2020 now, so 2070 is 5 feet. What are you going to do? Because most truck docks are 42, 48 inches, depending on what vehicles you're doing. So even, you might think, you know, I have a trucking business, when it floods, it's only 2 feet up the loading dock, you know, sure the wheels are wet, but merchandise is dry. That's not going to be the case in 2030. That's not going to be the case in the next winter. So we've been discussing, how do you make something resilient and still maintain the EPA uses? A number of the businesses that have installed sheeting walls, they may have the opportunity to install caps on, so you get another 2 feet. At some point, there's going to be a limit to, you know, how much you can cap something without installing new steel. So, you know, there's going to be interim measures, like we can probably raise portions of Market and Rover to get us to 2050. But after 2050, we know we're going to flood. So that's part of the solution. It makes our 7-foot wall maybe a 4-foot wall. So it has other cost savings by sort of merging these ideas together. But again, with the DPU, you can't just build a 3-foot wall. You can just build a 7-foot wall. So do existing businesses that use gangways, you know, is there a deployable barrier at the gangway, and then otherwise they can get to their floats? Some of the larger commercial ships certainly, you know, are, to say they're above whatever. But there's secondary effects, because sure, the ship shows up, but if your whole receiving area is flooded, or you have a washout area from your industrial activity, or you have some other metal storage facility, or you have a power plant with diesel generators, and there's any number of infrastructure, heavy infrastructure as well as light infrastructure that ends up being affected by this.
One of the things, I mean, in Everett there, you have a $2 billion complex being built.
I've heard.
They call it a casino, I think. How close is that to the impact area?
They are certainly on the coastline, and they are certainly in Phil Title's, I believe, for a good portion of the site.
So a ferry might be a good possible way to get to the casino from Chelsea?
They're putting one.
Down Route 16, I think, is the path that the ferry will take.
So in terms of the casino,
I would probably fit
so when they built the casino, they architecturally built it to like a 20-foot elevation or so. So it's high enough to, you know, really wait out the floodwaters. With that said, some of the area around it, like there's that pumping station that the Boston Water and Sewer uses, that's still low lying. So one of the dilemmas we're encountering is that the 2030 risk that are depicted on these maps has pretty clear flood pathways. The Allenton River is one, pretty, you know, simple, not simple to tackle, but the end of the century ones, though, start involving the areas around the casino. So you begin to see water flooding around the casino and then running along the railroad right away. And that then flanks essentially all of Everett and Chelsea, and subsequently will flood this area as well. So there are a number of improvements, not necessarily on the casino site, but the sites surrounding the casino that have to be made.
Okay. Thank you.
What's the tidal flow for, how high is it rising? What's it,
It's about 10 feet.
10 feet?
Yeah,
In which area?
everywhere.
Yeah, I think like the highest mean high tide we see here is like 12 feet during a king tide.
Okay.
But usually, yeah, around 9, 10.
So last March, we had, I want to say 3 feet of water at Spring Street, Route 16 in Everett.
Okay.
There happens to be, you know, several salvage yards there. There's a car wash there. Like, all that stuff you don't really want in the ocean.
Is that when the Seaport area had their flooding?
Yes, exactly. And at that point, when we went down here, the bank parking lot was all underwater. Part of the Market Street, Beach Street intersection was all underwater. The instances like that used to be really rare. I think they're becoming less and less rare, essentially.
The Earhart Dam, when was that built, and what is the purpose of that dam, and how does it affect the sea levels?
So I don't know when it was, do you know when it was built?
I think it was the 50s.
I think, yeah. So that part of so that dam separates the tidal influenced salt water part of the Mystic from the fresh water. The purpose of that was to ensure that there was, I think, one, high enough water levels upstream, and to also ensure that there was a healthy ecosystem there. That's not really why you build dams, though. I don't have a firm understanding on why they built it initially. Some of it is arguably flood control, but there are not enough pumps in the dam for it to actually be effective if it were to flood. One of the actions we're tackling right now with the city manager and our state delegation is requesting additional money for DCR so they can install a third pump in the dam. Because right now, and you know, the 2015 winter storms are a good example of this. When they came, 6 inches to a foot away from overtopping the dam, the dam just simply wasn't able to keep up with all the water. So as sea level rise increases, as precipitation worsens, and storms worsen in intensity and magnitude, we're going to start seeing more and more instances of the dam being overtopped and it not really acting as proper flood control.
Is there any underground water sources going under Everett into Medford where the dam is? In other words, can salt water still go under that huge tract of land by Wellington Circle and make what is supposed to be fresh water? Is that correct? Make it brackish? Is there any, because if Chelsea and Everett have all these underground rivers, it just, unless the geology is really complex, there's got to be some underground seepage from Chelsea Creek up through the dam, which complicates everything even more.
Definitely.
So certainly we've seen as part of the work that the city has done over the years in the Market Culvert, the swale upstream along the railroad track.
What is a swale?
What is a swale? The ditch full of water along the railroad track that you'll see between Bond Brothers and the Boston Market Terminal site. There's an open ditch there that was originally the head of the island Everett when the railway came through. When the Market Culvert has collapsed in the past, that brackish water has actually filled that upper end of the island Everett that's daylight, that's open to the air. So we know that there is movement and there's what they call hydraulic conductivity through the soils in that area. Now, I wouldn't expect those that conductivity to basically go north of Route 16. Route 16 is sort of on the original native soil in the area. It's sort of that type of boundary. But certainly to say that water couldn't find a path in the rail bed or some of the other aggregate soils and make its way through there, it's a much slower rate of flow than you see during these 24-hour, 100-year storm events. You see,
But it still could flow.
It's still definitely
My understanding was
rate.
part of the reason for the dam, and I would be wrong about this, and maybe just be flood control, was that there were species of freshwater fish up there further along. Actually, we can actually see some yachts going up there too.
and they were talking about herring runs or something.
Herring runs, yes, we have the annual herring run, the Illinois
And actually, I think there was a camera recently installed by the Mystic River Watershed Watershed Association.
They had their largest run.
Upcoming
Yeah,
one.
they had last year the largest run they've ever recorded before.
But that still doesn't mean that eventually the pressure from all the seawater flooding couldn't get up there and destroy some of those fish stocks, which they've been working on.
Well, the dam is more an impediment to those fish stocks
Than the saltwater,
than the
yeah.
saltwater.
Dams are really, even with properly designed fish ladders, so they can migrate up, they're really not good for fish. A lot of species have trouble navigating them. They're like high fatality rates for certain fish species when they are trying to swim up the fish ladder to the top part of the dam. So like, I guess the saying always goes in the environmental world, you know, a healthy river is a free-flowing river with no dams. And species thrive in those environments versus impoundments and dams and walls and the like.
And that's a state-owned dam.
That is a state-owned dam, yeah. And it presents, and this is one of the topics that our working group's deliberating over right now. While adding a pump to that really benefits upstream communities, the dam, the structural integrity of the dam, its pumping capacity, all can negatively affect downstream communities of Chelsea and Everett if there were to be a sizable flood and any sort of catastrophic accident. So in terms of what the next steps are in this project, so we are advancing this barrier design between now and July. That is going to be the first phase, which, zoom into the island right up here, covers the portion of the river, island and river, that runs from like the high point of Admiral's Hill all the way over to where the post office is. And then the city of Everett's proceeding with a conceptual design for their portion of the waterfront. There are multiple options for barrier types depicted here on the right-hand column. One of the big constraints, and this is almost a paradox of sorts, is that the designated port area regulations make it very difficult to install effective flood infrastructure. So one of the requirements of the designated port area is that there should be no impediments to maritime commerce. So they perceive any sort of physical barrier along the coastline as limiting the ability of a lot of these sites and companies from moving goods onto ships, moving goods off of ships, and accessing the docks and port areas. So the regulations right now prohibit a lot of what you would traditionally do, which is harden the coastline, essentially build large flood barriers, flood walls, or some sort of green infrastructure which would be elevated but have a more natural component to it that's more ecologically fitting. So we're exploring with the City of Everett right now various alternative routes the infrastructure could take while still offering the largest amount of protection for the industries and property owners along here. In Chelsea, while this is an industrial area that is at risk of flooding, the flood pathways and the floodplains also extend to where our high school is, where a large, dense residential neighborhood is, and a lot of state facilities and other regional assets. So this is high on our priority list. In our conversations with the state thus far, it appears to be on their priority list as well in terms of financing. But the designated port area piece of this is still the limiting factor for a cost-effective and feasible solution.
Historically, which came first, the designated port area or the city of Chelsea schools?
The DPA technically predates the actual physical high school, which was built in the 90s. Yeah, but I think
EPA was 80s.
DPA was 80s. I think the notion of public education definitely predates it all. Yeah.
Now, do you work in coordination with Boston? Because Boston is talking about, one of the things, putting up seawalls and all this. this stuff, which seems kind of crazy. But if you don't, I remember going down Sandy Hook and walking up Wall Street, and in the building I was going into, which was quite a ways up from the water, the first 2 floors of the building were completely submerged in water.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of blew my mind. And I say, well, gee, I would have to think if you stopped it in Boston, maybe the impact wouldn't be as great.
So we are working with the City of Boston. One of the vehicles we work with them through is the Resilient Mystic Working Group that we co-founded with the Mystic River Watershed Association, City of Everett, Somerville, Boston, focusing on the downstream area around Chelsea Creek and the lower Mystic area. They have a suite of proposed resiliency improvements for both their coastline that range from green infrastructure, creating large expansive parks that could act as natural flood storage, natural floodplains, to more traditional flood walls. And then you have this overarching conversation about the harbor barrier, which I think you were referencing in that. Right. So my understanding right now is that the harbor barrier, UMass did a pretty comprehensive study of it. Some of the economics within that study, they have portrayed the barrier to not have as large of benefits as it actually does, but it's still sort of, they're all deliberating it still. There still isn't consensus on the barrier itself. So we've been in conversation with them. Right now, they're primarily focused on East Boston. Maverick Station, for example, has been a topic that has been raised numerous times in our work with them, protecting that T station, Suffolk Downs as well, and then protecting the residential neighborhoods along the waterfront. They are also focusing right now on studying Charlestown around the Straff Center. So they're looking at where are the flood pathways, what are the heights of flooding, probabilities, that type of thing. But it's one of those situations where there's candidly very, very little money for this kind of thing, and we're all competing for the same pot of money. And this is sort of why one of the partnership between Chelsea and Everett is rare, because we realized that we both have a joint interest in this, and we could probably attain a larger share of federal funding if we team together and move this along more quickly than doing it by ourselves.
The Beecham Street reconstruction you mentioned, is the city of Chelsea paying for all of that up to the Everett line?
Not all of it. So we sought and obtained a $3 million grant from the Department of Commerce through their Economic Development Administration. For the feds. So the Department of Commerce recognizes this cluster of produce, specialty food distribution companies as vital to the national economy.
But why are you doing that? It seems like a stopgap measure. If the flooding is going to get much worse, all your reconstruction is just going to be washed away. So why do it in the first place unless it's a much more major project, maybe raising the
road? So we very closely explored raising the road. So I guess to start, with the Beecham Street reconstruction right now, we are calling for upsized drainage infrastructure, and that will solve some of the flooding issues, but not all of them. You're completely right that if we were to only rebuild the road and do nothing on the coastline, we'd just squander our money and it would all flood out. Raising the road becomes somewhat limiting for the businesses along the corridor. So, for example, a lot of these businesses, their buildings aren't set back that far. So when they're loading trucks in and out, they're pretty much right at the property line. So raising the road would then mean there isn't really a way to access those properties. And we've had this conversation. You're sort of electing to pursue an option that may put a lot of people out of business, to be quite candid. Raising the road here is also constrained by some of the environmental issues, the soil conditions. When we ran the numbers on elevating the road or pursuing coastal infrastructure and reconstructing the road normally, there wasn't really a large cost differential, and this area is substantially contaminated. At the end of the day, anything we do here, we're gonna have to pay for the environmental costs associated with that. So as we move along with the road reconstruction, in unison, we're moving along with this coastline solution right now. So yeah, it's a real question about access to the buildings. If we elevate the road, they can't necessarily access them. Property needs, that would mean that we would probably have to acquire property to provide the necessary access. And there are some environmental issues, but the environmental issues aren't insurmountable. They're something we can work around, but a lot of it stems from access.
I'm not sure if it's ever spoke. What's the problem with putting a barge on across the whole thing to be able to regulate the water flow in and out of that entire?
Say that again, sorry.
You talk about coastal reconstruction, and then you can't do it because it would block the port.
On the Everett side, yeah.
But what if it didn't block the port?
So that's a conversation we've begun having with the state, and they have a very, they have an interpretation of these regulations that hasn't, that precludes doing something like that, really. We could also, and we've explored this, design some sort of coastal barrier in Everett that would allow, cranes to lift goods and materials up onto ships, allow ships to, dock and do what they need to do. But it's still at odds with those regulations.
Question on insurance rates.
My favorite topic.
Really?
Just spent an hour talking about it, yeah.
Okay, you can take my car. The whole creek,
Yeah.
and probably the whole Mystic, well, indeed the whole Mystic waterway, has so much commercial property. Has anybody figured out what businesses have been paying for commercial insurance rates for their property if they're on the waterway for the last 10 years, and what projections for those rates going up are going to be? And as a related question, what about residences?
Yep.
What's going to happen to our insurance rates, our property insurance rates?
That's a good question.
Because, the feds are resisting. They're telling people don't build there.
Right, essentially, they're structuring it to discourage building.
Yeah, discouraged building, but a lot of these commercial buildings and some residences are right on the water.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen to insurance rates? And are people going to be so blown out of the water by those rates that there's going to be a desertion of population and businesses because
Right.
of those rates going?
So that's a really good question. Before this meeting internally with our city manager, we're having a similar discussion about commercial and residential insurance rates in the flood areas. There's more data on residential than there is commercial, and Greg can expand on this, but a lot of the commercial properties, all commercial properties buy private flood insurance versus the public flood insurance residential property owners buy. So the data on the commercial flood insurance is limited. It's not as accessible to us as the residential data is. But from what we've gathered, there have been a number, particularly in Everett, of commercial property insurance claims for losses associated with flooding. And they've been ticking up and up and up over the past couple of years. Residential rates, certainly we've been tracking, and they're trending upwards. Last year was the last year that the federal government subsidized residential flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. Before that, the feds were subsidizing a lot of it for people, and they had a policy shift, Capitol Hill, really with the intention of exactly what you said, not encouraging desertion entirely of areas, but to discourage people from building in those areas, living in those areas. Installing some sort of protective measures will, it'll have an impact on insurance rates, and what that impact is sort of, the jury's out on it in the academic world. But certainly their insurance rates will be higher if there's no protective flood infrastructure. If we were to build some sort of infrastructure, that would, in the insurance company's eyes, lower the risk and then lower the amount that they have to pay. Residential insurance would theoretically act similarly, although that program, because it's a federal program, may be a little bit slower to adapt.
I would also point out that the firms, the flood insurance rate caps that FEMA puts out, only take into account historical data. They do not consider any projections of what might happen in the future. So to the extent that we can abate flooding, the historical data will start to reflect that and potentially shrink the area.
So I'm going to bundle all that and then tag our future projects in the same breath. So as they noted, commercial properties and private insurance, it doesn't report to FEMA. Residential properties aren't in the immediate vicinity of this flooding, so they'll see it in the future, but we haven't seen that many public insurance claims comparatively. Obviously, people parking their cars down here, there's probably a lot of car claims, but those are likely spread out in commuting.
Those are private.
Right. But to say FEMA looks at car insurance claims as much as physical property, I don't know if they do. The fact that the commercial properties either have private insurance or have learned to live with flooding, as odd as that sounds, that directly affects the funding that we can get from FEMA through some of their disaster relief programs, hazard mitigation grant programs. Because they always want you to do a benefit cost analysis or a cost benefit analysis, as it's typically referred to. They want to know that if they give you a grant for $10 million, you can protect $20 million in claims. They want to see a 2-to-1 ratio on their investment. So when we look at funding some of our future projects, we can't look backwards. Looking backwards, there's not enough claims for us to justify some of these projects. But FEMA does have certain mechanisms that allow you to protect existing assets. So if we can quantify, what is the value of the regional produce center going down, that could be, millions of dollars a day, and that can affect a wide breadth of.
But not to throw a monkey wrench into that theory, if the feds give you $10 million, don't you think the private insurance company is going to say, ooh, cash cow,
Yep.
and now they're going to raise their rates because the cash cow
They're,
on the private?
when they calculate their rates, they're pricing risk. So the risk is declining in their eyes. The rates should theoretically decline. Now, that varies from insurance company to insurance company. That's standard practice. I'm sure there are companies that are going to do just that. They're going to say, oh, this is acknowledged, time to cash in.
And as we build these barriers within tide gates, the final step in this process, if we were to be able to build every berm that we wanted to along the coastline, the city would have to file a letter of map amendment with FEMA to basically get the flood maps realigned to reflect that, okay, a berm was done with the cross section that is mandated by the insurance rate map people. And that cross section gives you this level of protection, and therefore we've lowered your base flood elevation from 17 to whatever it is.
How do you get buy-in from commercial shipping companies who might claim that these so-called improvements to us, but to a shipping company, they might be impediments to transportation, and they might say, no, you can't build that because we can't get our ship close to it because you got the berm too close to our dock. How do you get buy-in from them? Because all they want to do is load and unload.
Right. So in the designated...
And the higher the tide, the easier it is for them to load and
Exactly.
unload. They don't care about the people who have the businesses, and they don't care about the people who live down.
So in
So what
the,
do you do?
in the designated port area where that activity is occurring right now, yeah, we simply can't. I mean, the easiest way to do this all would be to throw a barrier on the coastline. We're done, but we can't because of that very reason. So we are evaluating like Market Street, Bean Street, they're publicly owned rights of way right now to see how we could possibly reconstruct those and add barriers to them. So a lot of the properties would still be protected, but you wouldn't be necessarily impacting those companies that are shipping. And those companies can, over the years, raise their bulkheads, but because of the way the regulations are written right now, we're strictly prohibited from actually putting barriers along the coastlines where those companies are present.
So there's going to be pathways that we're going to end up deeming unfeasible. And they might be unfeasible because of the rail spur. They might be unfeasible because of the DPA. They might be unfeasible because we have to take properties. So what we're realizing is, and you can see it sort of on the graphic on the screen, one of the pathways, while it protects, say, 100 acres in Chelsea and 100 acres in Everett, it leaves out 2 or 3 commercial properties that are utilizing that DPA use. So what we end up being put in a position is to protect some of the non-DPA users and exclude some of the DPA users, not out of desire, but just out of regulatory compliance. And it's an evolving conversation. We're still trying to, we met with the state last week just to see, where do you follow this? What do you want us to do? Because they want us to protect, do you know how many acres contribute or get flooded in the 2070 model? It's got to be 300, 400 acres,
Yeah.
right? So, do you protect 300, 400 acres of commercial business and exclude 3 or 4, or do you not proceed in medical?
Isn't there it might be in the Netherlands, I'm not sure, or is it in the Netherlands? That they actually have built a gate. Has anybody done any research or called the Netherlands and said, in English, are you getting any pushback from ship owner on those gates? And how does your form of Dutch federal government deal with it?
So we've certainly engaged international consultants.
So this is Dahlia.
You're getting in shape, you're getting in real shape.
Dahlia's with One Architecture. They are a Dutch architecture firm that specializes in flood control design.
Yeah, so I assume you're referring to the gates, to the Rotterdam gates, that cost insane amount of money, about $1 billion, and kind of sunk the Dutch economy for about 30 years with great environmental impacts. So I think the similar concept was studied at the UMass Boston harbor barrier work, and the main conclusion was that they will still need to protect a lot of coastal properties, and there's not a lot of economic feasibility in building such a barrier, especially with passage of ships and keeping the harbor active. I don't know if there's any specific barrier we can put on the island and river itself, because it's still considered to be navigable water. So any type of outward solution that will go into the water will have to be negotiated with the Army Corps of Engineers, and it opens a whole other layer of permitting and kind of negotiation of access and use.
So one of the structural items you can work on with individual commercial properties is things, they make tide gates for your garage door. So it lays flat until you need to use it, and then it comes up and it prevents the water from going into your garage. So you can do that with individual doorways, you can do it with individual floor drains. You can go systematically through a property and install a couple hundred different devices to try and safeguard individual water intrusion points. And that's sort of doing it on the micro basis. Right. So it's doing it property by property. But it's also, as we talked earlier, it's going to be a layered defense, because some of those items are still not going to prevent you from being able to leave the building, get to your car, drive out of the flooded area. And so, how do we protect those other assets? How do we protect your building having the power to deploy these things if they're plugged into your building in the first place?
This is on the island and river, but looking at Chelsea, if I can for just a minute, you have all along the area there on Eastern Ave, and you have the new Forbes Summer Court, whatever it is. These are going to be big investments in the city. How does does this impact those areas as well?
So these specific flood pathways don't, but over in those areas, I didn't bring these maps with me, but I will print them out for you. We did model the flooding out to 2070 for all of those areas as well through a previous effort. So Marginal Street, Eastern Ave, Mill Creek, Crescent Ave, they're all exposed to flooding at 2030 as well as 2070 depths and probabilities. We just are wrapping up an engineering study with the Worcester Polytechnical Institute's engineering department. Their students performed a very rigorous study for Marginal Street on evaluating protective flood barriers along Marginal. I do know that DPW right now, with the Planning and Development Department, we are trying to wrap our heads really around the hydrology of Marginal Street and how we can redesign some of the stormwater infrastructure to begin storing some of that, inundated water, and also begin thinking about how the roadway can be redesigned to accommodate a barrier. As we get up Eastern Ave, we recently proposed funding in our capital improvement program for FY20, which will go before City Council this spring for restoration and resiliency study of Mill Creek, so we can begin analyzing what the risk of flooding from Mill Creek is and how we can solve some of it and abate some of it. That's a really unique area in the sense of the solutions being more nature-based, so we wouldn't necessarily be proceeding with a typical flood wall or elevated berm as you see here. We would be probably undertaking a layered defense of, restoring the habitat, ensuring that the river is healthy, creating some sort of, barrier that would protect the inland areas, but doing it in a way that is environmentally sensitive and isn't just a wall in the middle of a marsh. The larger privately owned parcels that were interesting, so Forbes, for example, as well as some of the other private property owners along the waterfront. We've been in countless conversations with them, recommending and steering them towards different resiliency measures that they could use. The unfortunate reality is all this stuff costs money, and there isn't a science behind incentivizing them. And right now, we are internally strategizing on how we can encourage private property owners as they're redeveloping sites to not just think about how they're protecting their coastline on the waterfront, but how they're designing their site's landscaping and drainage. What building materials are they using so they can reduce heat and the impact of heat during hot summer months, and start managing stormwater more appropriately. But Forbes is an interesting one because they are, it's going to be the largest residential development years that is also on the waterfront. And thank you.
To Joe's point, we're already flooding Lock Street, and on the other side, Burma Road. That's two Chelsea Housing Authority large complexes. That already flood. So if I don't see, if you're talking about not, I don't foresee a way you can naturally buffer that onslaught of water coming up to those areas. So it's already been underwater a few times, and I've never seen that before on Lock Street. This is,
Most of that isn't backing up from the ocean. That's the fact that the drainage area, the channel isn't big enough for it to head down to the ocean.
So when we say natural, we don't just mean like create some sort of piece of infrastructure that is green. We're also referencing what Carl has mentioned, Mill Creek. Sedimentation is a big issue. So one of the reasons you see Lock Street flooding, and it's worsened in the past year or two, is because right now there are large deposits of sediment, particularly the Parkway Common Bridge, for example. The clearance for water over the years has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk to the point where that's actually acting as a dam now, because all the sediment has to be taken out. So cleaning out sediment, the drainage system's also filled with sediment and has issues where the outfalls are. I think it's crucial to solving a lot of that, and is also in line with when we're speaking of natural solutions.
There are also, say, loan programs, grant programs through the state. Everett and Chelsea hosted a meeting last fall or last spring that, I think it's the Boston Architectural Association, one of those groups, offers free professional services to see, can we relocate your water heater? Can we relocate some of the building system components so that, yes, your first floor is going to flood, but the rest of the residents in that building are less affected. And so you can start looking at those programs, how you budget for them, and how do those apply.
So I think it's especially pertinent to the housing authority properties, because a lot of those, such as the one up on Lock Street, are at the end of their life cycle, and over the next 10 years will have to be overhauled. So it's really a prime opportunity to design those sites to manage stormwater, manage heat, but that's all really dependent on this drainage issue being solved.
What are the proposed solutions that you have now, or is this simply starting that conversation and generating public awareness?
Right, so our proposed solution right now is broad. So we do know, and we've evaluated, and our findings state that we need some sort of protective barrier. So in Chelsea, that would be along the embankment of the Island End River, through the Island End Park, over to Admiral's Hill, where the elevation starts rising. One of the points that we're uncertain of right now is what the route of that in Everett will be. So we're fleshing that out over the next 2 months, and we are also moving the design of that elevated barrier in Chelsea along to the end point. The next public meeting we're going to hold in May, we're going to start diving into the architectural features of that barrier. So what type of facade and colors will it have, textures, public access, that type of thing.
Ballpark cost of the barrier like that?
In Chelsea, our ballpark cost right now for the Island End River over Admiral's Hill, depending on barrier type, the cheapest option is about 10 to 12 million. The most expensive options can range between 30 to 40 million. The big cost prohibitive piece here is, even if we go with the most inexpensive option, is the fact that we have to essentially sink piles down to where the bedrock is, about 100 feet down, in order to structurally support a barrier. And that, coupled with contamination issues, becomes pretty expensive.
Earlier, we talked about using federal funds to reconstruct Beecham Street. Beecham Street, in and of itself, any roadway is about a 20-year lifespan on a good day. And we're talking about a federal freight corridor where, I think anybody that's taken a bike or a car down Beecham Street in the last year has probably regretted it. So certainly, to the extent that we're using federal dollars to repair a freight corridor, there's short-term benefits that the lifespan of the roadway won't even see 2070. We're going to end up rebuilding Beecham Street 3 times by the time we get to the point that it's necessary that it becomes automatic.
quick question, Greg, about the levee across from the gazebo. A few years back, I recall it was stone and wood, and now it's all steel beams. Was that put in there just to replace a crumbling old infrastructure, or was height added to that for flooding purposes?
So unfortunately, I've only been with Everett about 18 months, and we did some,
This is Bostonian food.
You know, across from the gazebo in Chelsea, there's that rail line that goes to whatever it is, gravel and the refrigerated food place there. And a few years ago, it was stone, old stone with, looked like wood. And now it's steel with wood, I believe, and some kind of concrete filler in between. You familiar with that at all?
so in my experience, they had a timber seawall, and they had a Chapter 91 license for timber seawall, and they went into the Chapter 91 authority and said, we'd like to replace our wall with a steel type wall. They, one for one, we're not going to fill the river anymore, we're not going to be more impactful. They would typically allow you to change materials and go through that
But you don't know
exercise.
why they did it specifically.
They also had 21E issues. There were chemical leaks coming out of it that they needed to remediate. So, yeah,
So the elevated berm idea, are you guys exploring the possibility to have on the waterward side a slope, gentle slope where you could actually have marsh habitat created as well and permitted as a restoration project?
We are. So part of this study and design process is we are conducting a feasibility assessment of various restoration options for Island and River. So we are looking at how we can design some sort of barrier to accommodate that, but also what type of restoration needs to occur in the marsh itself. So if we do end up with something that's elevated, that doesn't slope on the water side, we are trying to be attentive to restoring the habitat below it. Not trying to be cynical, but one of the big constraints here is that this is one of the most contaminated areas in the state, and the New England Gas and Coke plant left a legacy contamination issue where it polluted severely the land where the produce center is, to the point where we still have petroleum and oil and tar bubbling up. So any sort of restoration needs to be preceded by a pretty extensive cleanup effort of the surrounding land, because there is the tidal influence to it. So any land that's contaminated, even if it's 100 to 1,000 feet away from the coastline, those contaminants are still migrating down to the Island and River, which is one of the reasons why year after year the Island and River receives a grade F in water quality. So we're exploring it, but we're also trying to address the underlying environmental remediation that has to occur.
And also looking to improve the flows, so tread lines on the road.
So that, so in May, we'll hold a large public meeting where we will present architectural options for barriers. It'll be more visual. It'll be set up sort of like a workshop. We'll have different stations for different components of the barrier, and we can begin a dialogue on how we can be designing the barrier, what types of public amenities can be associated with it, ranging from very robust to something much more modest, and be able to start speaking to the specific costs associated with each of those options. At that point, we'll also be further along and wrapping up our study of environmental restoration along the marsh, and also have a firmer understanding of some of the geological and environmental factors that have to be controlled for here. So that'll be most likely in mid-May. It could possibly be after Memorial Day, but we'll provide notice about a month in advance before that comes up. If there are any other questions, we're here to hang around it and discuss.
If anyone wants to help, 8:30, we're meeting at City Hall
Yes.
on Saturday and going out to clean Napa Island and for Earth Day?
You better bring a big truck, because walking there today, I mean, I was simply amazed at how much has come in the marshes and all. So bring the big truck.
Definitely.
We'll tell Fidel.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.